All right, thank you everyone for joining. This is Mark Donald with OnTech Systems. Today we're going to be doing a webinar on working securely remotely and how to keep your data safe while you or your staff is working from home. I'm going to be joined today by the two presenters, Jared Olson and John May. Jared is our Cloud Services Manager and has his hand in the security pod here, along with John May, who is our Solutions Engineer, Project Manager, and also does a lot with our security team here at OnTech. So I wanted to take the time to introduce everyone, or at least introduce them, and welcome you guys and let you know for this webinar, the questions are going to be addressed at the end of the meeting. So as attendees, you guys are currently muted, but there is a dialog box that you're able to chat and submit some questions, and Jared and John will be able to address those. We're also recording this webinar, so if you find it valuable and you'd like to share this with other peers you have at your company or a leadership team, we'll be sending out this recording later today. So first off, pretty clear reason why we selected this topic for this week. I think a lot of business owners are presented with new challenges in the disaster recovery type of area. We were all kind of hit with this COVID-19 challenge, and some businesses were prepared, some businesses not so much. And moving forward, the goal of this meeting is really to talk about the organizational challenges that companies are facing. We want to talk about some remote access tools and capabilities that businesses and decision makers like yourself on the IT side of things may look at going forward. There's access controls. Also, we've got a lot of attendees that are in healthcare and government, law firms, companies with a lot of personal identifiable information. So there is some regulatory compliance that we want to address. And then lastly, like I mentioned before, there are some closing remarks and some Q&A that we'll get to towards the end of the event. So I appreciate you guys all jumping on the call. Again, if you have questions, hold those till the end. And I'm gonna pass this over to Jared and John. Thank you all for your time.
Good morning, everybody. This is Jared Olson. As Mark said, I'm Cloud Services, Managed Services Manager at OnTech. Been at OnTech for, going on 8 years now here. Very excited to be talking to everybody today about some of these best practices, I guess you could say. And these are things that don't necessarily need to be looked at as solely right now. These can be things that you look at in the future as well, that as the workforce continues to be more decentralized, as your employees look for more remote access capabilities or more functionality outside of the office. These are things that are just in general going to be great for your business to be considering in the future. So as Mark said, organizationally, there's a lot of challenges that are presenting not only the leadership teams, but the employees as well. How do you maintain good leadership in a situation where your workforce might be more remote than it has ever been before? How do you look at allowing and enabling more employee productivity, whether that's through software tools, whether that's through communication tools? We're going to get into some of those pieces as we talk up today. One of the other things that I think is a major challenge is looking at progress and having visibility to that progress. So what I mean there is, if you have teams that are working on projects, if you have teams that are working on presentations or proposals, quotes, estimates, whatever it might be to your industry, having visibility of that progress is typically done through some level of software, CRM programs, whatever it might be. But that is a major challenge in the current state that we're living in and the state that we'll be living in as, again, like I said earlier, people continue to work more remotely and be more decentralized. In addition to that, how do you keep your team engaged? How do you keep them communicating with each other and collaborating together, and in all of that, allowing it to be easy to use and functional for everybody, whether they're at their home or they're in a remote office, in a satellite office, whatever that might be. Additionally, how do you maintain your regulatory obligations while the workforce is more decentralized? If you're in a healthcare industry and you probably in a clinic, you might be physically there, but there might be people outside of the office that also need to continue to maintain the regulatory compliance that you'd otherwise be maintaining within that office. So I do like that picture there. I wish my remote access scenario was me sitting on a porch looking into the trees, but I'm pretty confident that not a lot of us are dealing with that situation with kids or with distractions or whatever it might be. And I did like that stat regarding the amount of executives. 76% of executives agree that organizations need to dramatically re-engineer the experiences that bring technology and people together in a more human-centric manner. That's directly from Accenture Technology, recently posted out there, so you can also search that out if you're looking for more of a comprehensive guide on that. So Mark or John, if you guys have any other comments along the way, feel free to obviously throw them out there. So now that we've kind of set the stage for what organizations are dealing with as a challenge, I wanted to talk about some of the pitfalls that might come along with those challenges. Is your organization ready to provide remote access tools to their employees? Do you have a decentralized network, essentially, where you could allow secure VPN access in, allow somebody to be able to remotely control their desktop at the office from their home computer? And if you're doing those things and you do have those tools, which are great, how do you continue to maintain data security around that? People are connecting from their home networks. People might be at a place where there's open Wi-Fi, not only in the current state where things are maybe a little more closed from a Starbucks perspective or a library's perspective or an airport's perspective, but these things continue to be challenges and pitfalls as we enable the workforce to work remotely. So data security is a huge concern and a topic that businesses need to be thinking about all the time. One of the other pitfalls is employee awareness, and by this I mean, are your employees aware of some of the risks that are out there to not only themselves but to the business data that they are accessing? Education is very key to employee awareness. So one of the things that organizations can do is consider the training their employees, making sure that they're aware of what's going on out there. Right now, there's a lot of malicious attempts trying to prey on fear, trying to lure people in with phishing and social engineering attempts to, again, prey on that fear to get them to click on something that maybe they shouldn't have, that would then release some type of malicious software onto their computer or a virus onto their computer. If that computer's at their house and they're connecting to your corporate office, there's some risks that are inherently coming from that. So again, how do you maintain that data security while also allowing convenience from remote workers? So I talked a little bit about it, the lack of control when you're not necessarily configuring your employees' home office, right? You're not putting in the hardware equipment, you're not putting in the firewall, you're not updating their antivirus software like you would if you were maybe controlling the computers in the corporate office. So how do you maintain a little better control over those things? Internet reliability, I guess, would say isn't a major pitfall, but right now it seems to be a pitfall due to the influx of traffic that are going on with the local internet providers, and not only them, but the massive cloud hosting providers. Microsoft is an example. In one day, they had 12 million people sign up for Teams. The event, that's what we're using right now. We're using Microsoft Teams for this event. 12 million people in one day signed up for a new subscription to Teams. The taxation that goes on the internet connections across the entire world increase tremendously as those things get enabled, and and it's just ever important to continue to have good, reliable internet connectivity, whether you're at your house or you're at your corporate office. as I mentioned earlier, there's some scammers and there's some cybercrime that is happening right now through social engineering and phishing, and that will continue as it always has. Hackers will follow ways to socially engineer people at all times. Okay. I think we can, well, actually, John, can you back to that slide? You can see there was one organization that had 61,000 people. That's Accenture. In one day, in 5 days, they were able to move people to this corporate collaboration solution in less than 5 days. That's tremendous to me. And that just shows how people really come together in time of need like this, and people really do work for the common good. So sorry, John, you can go ahead to the next slide now. Okay. So we talked about the organizational challenges and some of the remote access pitfalls. And now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the critical business services that you maybe would want to think about. How do you maintain them? How do you keep them operational in the current state that we're living in? I can't define what everybody's business critical IT services are, but I can guess that email, phone system, voice, conferencing, things like that, being able to enable communication are probably very critical to most businesses. Line of business software, your customer relationship management systems, your shipping department software, and the ability to send product out of your building. If you're in a manufacturing environment, having those machines operational so that you can produce the widgets that you need to produce to your vendors. There's a variety of business services that are considered critical depending on the nature of your business. So considering those and thinking about how do you maintain reliability? How do you maintain uptime with those systems during times like this and in the future as well? Business continuity is huge. It's not just about my computer being operational. It's about my email being operational. It's about me being able to access the files I need to be able to access at any time from anywhere. Is my infrastructure going to stay online? Is my hardware new enough? Is it covered by a warranty? Can I guarantee that within some reason that these things are going to operate for my staff? And lastly, the data backup and disaster recovery is always hugely important, no matter what we're looking at here. There's two types. There's the data backup portion that absolutely has to be functional 100% of the time. And then if something were to happen with that infrastructure or your systems, how do you recover from a situation like that? So I think those are important things we all need to be thinking about to maintain not only business security, but maintain operational availability. And I believe John is going to take over here and talk a little bit about some of the other portions of the presentation. So thank you for your time.
Thanks, Jared. So just a little bit about myself. My name is John May. I'm a solutions engineer, which means that when our clients need solutions to their technical problems, I come up with those solutions and help get them implemented. So what I'm going to talk about here is kind of the tools available for remote access, the pros and the cons, what things you got to look out for with each solution to kind of help you guys decide what the best way to provide remote access for your employees is, because every company is different, every situation is different. And so you want to look at the tools available and see what is, what's going to make the most sense. So we'll go into the different solutions like VPN, remote access software, remote desktop services, and cloud services, kind of go into those a little bit. So VPN is an acronym that stands for Virtual Private Network, and essentially it works by making the device that you run it on a part of your corporate network. I liken it to, when you send a letter in the mail at the post office, and that letter you use one of those security envelopes that has the hashes on the inside so that so the person looking at the envelope can see where it's going to and who it's coming from because of the addressing on the envelope, but it can't see the contents. That's essentially what VPN does. It makes the traffic going from the device remote to your corporate network encrypted and secure. And so that is essentially how VPN works. So when you're connected to VPN, you can access file shares, you can access internal resources, things like that, with relatively little difficulty. The pros of this technology, it's mostly fully functional. There are some situations where certain applications that are very bandwidth intensive, we run into a lot of problems with things like QuickBooks and Sage or other applications that are based on databases, can have problems sometimes. Also, large file transfers can have issues sometimes if you're doing a lot of work with media files like audio, video, things like that. VPN might not be the best solution for you, but for the most part, everything works exactly the way it would if that device were located inside your network. It's also inexpensive depending on the current solution. Essentially, you just have to, if you already have a firewall that can do VPN traffic, you just have to buy. Usually, there's some fees to buy the licensing, and they usually license it on a per concurrent device basis. So if you have 50 users, but only 10 of them are really going to be remote at any one time, you really generally only need to buy 10 licenses. It depends on the solution, but that's usually how most places license their VPN. It's also secure. Most modern VPN solutions are based on modern encryption technologies that are very secure, hard to crack, and provide a level of confidentiality and security to the traffic that's going back and forth. Most regulatory bodies like HIPAA or FIPS or anything like that have regulations around how that's configured, and most modern VPN solutions will be able to meet those. Some of the disadvantages of this technology, like I said before, some applications may not work correctly. Again, if you've got QuickBooks or Sage or any other kind of database-backed applications, those might not work quite the way that you're expecting them to, or they'll be extremely slow. It's extremely bandwidth dependent. I mean, if you've got a really, really high level of bandwidth at your office and a really, really high level of bandwidth at your home, you're running fiber in both locations, and that might not be as big of a deal. But for the most part, what we found is most places don't have that kind of bandwidth available to them. There is a risk of insecure configuration. So if you have someone configure your VPN for you and they're not necessarily as up on the latest trends from a security and an encryption perspective, they may use an older encryption technology, which most modern VPNs actually do support for backwards compatibility purposes. But if they configure it with that insecure technology, it may mean that even though you're connected via VPN, you may not be as secure as you think you are. There's also a risk of using with uncontrolled devices. So usually what we recommend is that you use VPN with computers at the person's home that you as an organization have control over. It's a laptop that the organization owns that you have the appropriate monitoring and management on, or it's a portable device that has the same type of management and monitoring. We usually don't recommend that you allow users to install VPN on, say, their home computer, because you have no idea if they're patching it properly. You have no idea if they have good antivirus. You don't know if some of the software that they're running on there may have some kind of backdoor built into it that allows a malicious access simply from running the application. I've had situations where people use VPN with their home computer and it's also their kid's computer, which is a recipe for disaster, as probably most of us know. Kids like to download and install stuff, and sometimes if they're just ignorant of what's out there and how it can affect the computer. So we usually don't recommend that you use VPN with a home device. If all they have is a computer they have at home, VPN is probably not the best solution in this case. The next technology is remote access software. So this are the technologies like LogMeIn or TeamViewer, where you install software on the person's computer at the office, and it allows a remote window into that computer. So you can log into the software and you can see exactly what's on the computer and interact with it as if you were right in front of the computer. The pros of this is it's fully functional. Everything that you can do on the computer at the office, you can do with this technology. There's no slowdowns because everything is really being processed and handled locally on the corporate network. There's no traffic that's going back and forth between the person's remote device, except for showing what's on the screen. So you don't have to worry about slowdowns or anything like that with regard to processing time. It's usually accessible from any device. Most of the modern technologies, LogMeIn and TeamViewer and other companies that have their own products, they allow for usability on things like tablets and stuff like that. So if you have like an iPad at your house, you could use your iPad to access your computer at the office. If you plug a Bluetooth keyboard and mouse into it, and you're good to go. Again, it's secure. Most of these technologies use the same secure technologies that VPNs use from an encryption perspective. So you don't have to worry about transmitting that data back and forth. So that's a good thing as well. Some of the disadvantages, the training burden is generally higher because you have to teach your users a new method for doing something. You know, with VPN, you have them log into a piece of software and then the computer behaves similarly to how it would be at the office. With this, you have to teach them how to fire up the software on their other computer, maybe do some installations. You know, they have to know how to navigate the software in order to get access to the computer at the office. So, and while it's not difficult, it is an additional training burden that you're going to want to be able to account for ahead of time. Some of your users may pick up on it right away, not a problem there. Other users may need a little bit more hand-holding until they're comfortable with it. In general, it is more expensive. You generally, aside from, you know, with VPN, you buy a license, it's usually a one-time license, you don't have to buy it again. This software, they usually license it on a per device basis, and it's usually a monthly or a yearly subscription fee. So you're paying for it even when you're not using it. So let's say you buy 50 copies of this remote access software, you know, and you don't use it 8 months out of the year, but you want to maintain it, so you're still going to be paying for that. So in general, the pricing is going to be a little more expensive. You also need an additional device to access. So you need a device at the person's house in order to access the computer at the office. With VPN, if they have a laptop, you could just take that laptop home with them. So there is a little bit more of a burden in terms of device management if you're going to give them a device to do that with. One of the things I do want to note about this for those customers of ours that use our desktop management services to do their patching and stuff like that, that fee that you're paying for that includes a license for LogMeIn, which would fall under this category. So if you are currently an RMM client for managed services on your desktops with us, call us and see about how we can get you hooked up with that for your users. It's pretty straightforward. We have good instruction sets on how to make that work for your users, and it's something you're already paying for. So, you know, you might as well get your users up to speed on that if that's something that's interesting to you. The next thing is called RDS, which is an acronym for Remote Desktop Services. This is where you have a server class device that people can log into and get a desktop experience. So you may have a server class device that has Office installed on it and your other line of business applications, and then they can essentially log into this server device and have access to all those applications just with a desktop, just as if they were in front of their computer at the office. The nice thing about this is that you have one device, in this case a server, and multiple people can log into it. So you don't have to maintain 5, 10, 15, 20 computers in order for these users to access this. And also, you know, it doesn't necessarily even need to be on site in your office. We do have clients that use Azure services to host this type of a solution for them. And so it works very well, you know, and some of the pros, again, full functionality. Anything that you can do that's installed on this remote desktop server will work just fine. It's local to your instance, so you're not going to experience any slowdowns or things like that. You're looking at, depending on how you do it, it's an operating expense versus a capital expense. So, you know, if you go out and you buy a physical server and install remote desktop services on it, that may be more of a CapEx solution. But if you, let's say you go with an Azure hosted remote desktop server, that may be more of an operating expense because you're paying a monthly fee for that. So depending on how that works out and how you as an organization like to do your accounting, that may be an advantage for you. I used to work for a company that they leased everything. And it's because they did not want to do capital expenses. They just didn't want to deal with the depreciation and everything like that. So they tried to make everything as much of an operating expense as possible. So all of our computers, all of our servers, all of our networking equipment was all leased. The other advantage is it's secure. Again, the technology used to encrypt and protect the connection between this remote desktop server and your client is secure and works very well. We do get into some situations, which I'll get into in the, it's not really in the cons, so I'll mention it right here, where if it's not configured correctly and you don't have good password policies and stuff like that on the back end, it can be insecure. I'll give you an example. We've had clients in the past where they had a solution like this and we were not aware that they, for example, that they were not causing people's accounts to get locked out after a certain number of missed passwords. And so what was able to happen is people were, hackers were able to go in and just brute force the password, just try to keep trying passwords until they got in. So when you're doing something like this, you want to make sure that you have good policies on the back end to help support it from a security perspective. Some of the cons, this is probably the more expensive solution that you would have, depending on what your needs are, just because you have to have a server or you have to have an Azure instance of a server in order to support this. So it may be offset by lack of hardware. So depending on how you set it up, you could theoretically use this as a desktop replacement to where you don't have people with full computers in the office. They just use a device that's very inexpensive called a thin client to connect to this instance of a server that provides them a virtual desktop. And so you know that may offset some of that, but in general, this solution is going to be the most expensive of the three that we've talked about so far. The training burden is about the same as remote access software, so there is a training that needs to happen to your users in order to be able to access this solution. And again, you need an additional device to access it. So if you're, you know, it's not giving them access to a computer at their desk, it's giving them access to this server that has the software they need on it. So you need something that's going to access that, whether that's a cheap thin client that they would have or a full-blown computer that they would use to access. And then finally, there's, you know, cloud services, and I'll talk about this in terms of this is what the OnTech currently overwhelmingly uses. You know, we talk about things like Office 365 and SharePoint. You know, we use SharePoint for all of our file sharing now. We have a highly remote and mobile workforce for the most part, and we found that having SharePoint works really well for us because we don't have to worry about VPN or other solutions in order for our workers to get access to the stuff that they need. There's Azure Virtual Desktop Infrastructure, where essentially it's similar to remote desktop services, but instead of being on one big monolithic server or a cluster of servers, each user gets their own virtual desktop instance, so their own little mini virtual desktop that they can log in, and it behaves like a normal desktop. And then cloud applications, you know, so everybody's got that website that they log into to access something, whether it's, you know, QuickBooks Online, or they may have a hosted solution from a vendor of theirs where they log in, and in maybe payroll or maybe HR or maybe other, you know, ERP systems or other solutions that aren't hosted locally within your environment. They're hosted by your vendor and you log into their system. So those are the kind of things that we are talking about here. The pros, if you're fully in the cloud, it's fully functional for you guys, because it doesn't matter if you're in the office or if you're at home or you're at the coffee shop on a hotspot. you've got the full functionality always. I can work equally effectively from my desk in my office, a client site, my house, and or, whatever. During this pandemic, I've been working from home. I can count on one hand the number of times I've had to leave my house, which has its own set of social problems, but it's not what this is about. And I've been able to be completely effective working from home in that regard. So having OnTech on cloud services is exceedingly functional and has been really, really great for how we do work. Again, it's available from anywhere and it is secure if it's configured correctly. So we don't have to worry about people getting access to our files or stuff like that because we have our security set up correctly. And the messages that are transmitted back and forth are secure because we're using modern encryption. Cons, depending on the needs, it might be more expensive than on-site resources. And what I mean by that, if all you need to do is do some file storage and things like that, where you can get away with using SharePoint Online and maybe OneDrive, you probably don't even need a full server locally. And I can almost guarantee you that moving your file shares and stuff like that to SharePoint Online and OneDrive is probably in the long run going to be, and even in the relatively short run, is going to be less expensive than buying new hardware to support a growing environment. By default, organizations when they get SharePoint Online get 1 terabyte of shared storage with SharePoint Online, and each individual user gets 1 terabyte of personal storage for themselves. And that licensing generally comes with most SKUs of Microsoft 365 Business. So it's for a lot of our clients, it's something they're already paying for and not necessarily utilizing to the full functionality there. But in some cases, if you need special needs, like if you have an ERP system that can't be hosted in the cloud, or you have other applications, like for example, we run into a lot where people use QuickBooks and they can't move to online because there's functionality missing from the online version that they need, so they have to use the local version, or other things like that. Moving that kind of stuff to cloud, to cloud services where you're hosting it in Azure, for example, that can get fairly expensive pretty quick, depending on the solution. So when you're deciding whether you want to do this, it's really up to your organization how exactly that is modified and that is handled. There is some retraining that happens with users because accessing files on SharePoint is very different than accessing them from a shared map drive. So in many cases, depending on how you do it. So, there is going to be some retraining of users. There's going to be an acclimation period. People are probably going to complain because people hate change. But in the long run, it's going to be a good thing and it'll be easier for them, I think. And you still need something to access that stuff. I have a laptop. It's not like my files magically appear in front of me in thin air. We're not quite at that level of technology yet. So you're still going to need something that the user would have, and you need to be able to have a way of managing that device. But in general, they're already going to have that anyway. So now that we've talked a little bit about tools, I wanted to talk a bit about controls. So these are the policies, the procedures, how do you manage this stuff, and how does it go into how do you manage your remote users in the devices your remote users are using so that you don't lose data, you don't have compromises, things like that, to where because the devices are at their homes, there is a higher risk. I was reading an article the other day about how a lot of bad actors and hackers on the internet are actually compromising computers that people have at home and then waiting because they know they're not at the office yet. So they're waiting until the pandemic finishes up and they bring those devices back into the office. So how do we protect against that kind of stuff? And a lot of it comes down to these kind of controls. When you're trying to figure out where your organization fits within this control scheme in security is always a balancing act between being secure and ease of use. The most secure computer on the planet is going to be a computer that never gets turned on and is in a locked room underneath a concrete bunker, right? But how easy is it to use that thing? You know, it's impossible, right? The easiest to use computer on the planet is going to be one that's completely open with no passwords and it's just flat on the internet and anybody can access it, but that's not secure at all, right? So you need to find a point that is appropriate for your organization and your tolerance for risk to maintain that good security balance. There's never going to be an easy answer to this question where you come to me and say, how can I be secure? The answer is always going to be, it depends, because a lot of it is based on your tolerance for risk and, you know, the cost and a lot of other functions and features there. So data loss prevention, and you know, a lot of times you'll see this as the acronym DLP. What this is keeping your data from getting to places where you don't want it. So for example, this is a really common one. I'm going to work from home tonight and work on some spreadsheets over the weekend. So I'm just going to, and I don't have access to this stuff when I'm at home. So I'm just going to email the spreadsheets to my Gmail account, and then I'll open them and work on them at home over the weekend, and then I'll email them back to myself for Monday. The problem with that is now, let's say these spreadsheets have very critical, sensitive data on them. They're going through other email systems and other devices that you have no control over. You don't know what the disposition of their email account is. It could be compromised for all you know. You don't know what the disposition of their home computer is. There could be issues there. And so what you want to do is think about these kind of situations and say, how do we protect against this? What do we do? And the type of controls that are available for this are, there's a number of them. You can configure your email system to search for certain types of attachments and not allow those attachments to go out. You can configure your firewall so that it's blocking access to third-party file sharing and email programs. There's a there are specialized applications that just do data loss prevention that go into a lot of this type of stuff. And so, you know, if this is something that's of concern to you, you can come talk to us. We can talk about the options and kind of go through, you know, what exactly, you know, is the concern and how we can address it. But it's something that more and more organizations are being concerned with, especially when they have regulatory requirements. So device management and app control. So this is another thing where if you're gonna, you know, you can mandate as a policy, you can say, if you're going to access our systems remotely, then we have certain policies that have to be met with regard to the disposition of that computer. It has to be up on its patching. It has to be up on its antivirus. We have to have management control over it. So for example, we have organizations where they have management software on it that patches it up and makes sure that the antivirus is up to date. They use what's called mobile device management on their mobile devices, like their phones and their tablets, so that we can control what you can and can't do, and what you give the ability for us to remotely wipe and encrypt the devices if necessary. These are things that, if you're going to allow devices into your network for whatever reason, you want to make sure that you have some level of control over that. So like, for example, my computer has management on it so that we can patch it automatically. It's got good antivirus on it that's updated, and if it gets out of compliance, we get alerts on it. My phone for work has mobile device management on it through Microsoft Intune, which allows the company to remotely wipe the phone if they need to. It allows them to also, at a very extreme level, if they wanted to, they could control what I can do with the phone, what I can and cannot install on the phone, what I can do with it, so on and so forth. So depending, again, on your level of risk tolerance, you can kind of use these software suites to manage that kind of solution there. And then I'm going to turn this over to Jared to kind of talk about the last few things here as far as policies and procedures, cyber liability insurance, and stuff like that.
Thanks, John. Yeah, I think that was really excellent information in there for everybody to know a little bit more about. Obviously, I don't know if everybody was on at the time that John posted that. If you had any questions during the meeting, feel free to post them in the chat log here, and we can address them towards the end here as well. So policies and procedures, that's kind of a unique thing for each business, but from a security standpoint, it doesn't have to be extremely unique. There's some common best practices and things that you can be considering and looking at from getting your employees up to speed and aware of what those policies and procedures might be for your particular company. And specifically, I guess I would say that it's a work in progress. It's a journey to establish, maintain, and adhere to the policies and procedures that you define. There's no company that can start with a policy and procedure today and implement it tomorrow and make sure everybody's following it the next day. It's an ongoing thing. It's a work in progress. It can definitely be daunting, but starting somewhere and having a foundation for what your organizational policies and procedures are can have resounding effects on your employees, the way you conduct your business, the way you maintain security, the way you set expectations with employees and maintain those expectations and hold them accountable to those expectations. So there's a lot of benefits that can come from it. It is definitely a concerted effort that requires many people within the organization to kind of collaborate on to maintain, to create, maintain, and enforce those policies and procedures. So as we've said here, having written policies is important. They definitely should be covering as much as the company can deem necessary. And like we say here, it needs to include remote work and what those policies and procedures are for remote work. If you want to allow people to connect from their home computer, but you need them to have your antivirus or they need to go through a VPN, for example, those are things that should be expressly written out in those policies and reviewed with those employees at the time that they start with your company. And they should probably be reviewed at least annually, maybe more frequently, depending on the nature of your business or your requirements or what you feel is important for your business. So the next part of this, excuse me, that we wanted to talk about was the cyber liability insurance portion of any business. There are providers out there, business insurance providers that offer cyber liability insurance. It's an extremely important part of your insurance strategy, and it's an extremely important part of how you posture yourself from a security standpoint to prevent risk. That's really what it's all about, is what level of risk can I prevent, or what level of risk can I take that is acceptable per my insurance company. And what I mean by that is there's some things that may or may not be covered depending on what your practices are. So if your insurance company requires that you have disk encryption for all of your laptops, for example, but you don't have that in place, the premiums and the liability coverage may be less than what it normally would if you were following those best practices. And we have actually seen that recently with some that we've been helping some of our clients review and establish what risks they're willing to take, what level of coverage that they need, what's it going to take to get them to that level to increase their coverage. For example, I believe multi-factor authentication is starting to be required by a lot of the insurance companies. If you're not providing a second form of authentication to access email or other systems within your IT environment, you may be less covered by your cyber liability insurance. And on this slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about the various types of regulatory compliance. There's obviously many different regulatory compliance that exists out there, depending on what type of business transactions you conduct. So if you're in the payment card industry and you're doing point of sale, you have to be compliant with PCI. If you're in the healthcare industry and you're dealing with PII, you're going to have to deal with HIPAA and potentially other regulatory compliance requirements. Global data protection is something that if you are doing business overseas, you will have to, at least currently or in the future, be starting to plan around how you maintain that global data protection regulation. And honestly, I do see that as something that's going to eventually hit the States as well. Right now, it's the European Union that is enforcing the global data protection regulations, but that is definitely going to be coming to the United States and other countries, I would imagine, at some point very, very soon. So those compliance regulations have stringent requirements when it comes to how you handle and process corporate and personal data. And with that, your remote access software needs to have security controls in place to help you comply. So if, like I mentioned it earlier, if you're not providing a multi-factor authentication, and that's a control that's needed for you to maintain regulatory compliance, that's something that you'll want to evaluate with the remote access software that you're utilizing, or how you're allowing your employees to connect. A lot of them will require a VPN to encrypt the session that's happening between the end user at home or in a remote office back to the corporate office. It's more prevalent than we'd like to see, but we still commonly see, back to that convenience and security, or that ease of use and security portion that John was talking about. We see a lot of people just making it easy for employees to connect, not specifically with regulatory compliance, but just in general. Maybe they've been misguided by an IT company that's just allowing them to connect in without any security, without a VPN. We see, I would say 75% of the customers that end up getting ransomware usually have some wide open door in their network that's allowing this traffic to kind of come in. So one of those is remote desktop that John was talking about earlier. There's a right way to do it and there's a wrong way to do it. Again, the right way to do it is to make it secure and a little less convenient. The wrong way to do it is to make it insecure and make it extremely convenient so anybody can connect. If you think about that for a second, if it's easy for me to walk into your house, and the door's published out there, you put it on Facebook, you're out of town, if I don't lock my doors, I know that I can get into your house pretty simply. If I'm not publishing it, I'm protecting myself, I'm not publishing it, I've got good locks, I've got security cameras, I've got pieces in place, motion detectors, whatever it is, that is obviously much better, but a lot less convenient from a management standpoint and a capability standpoint. So think about that. Don't make it easy for people to connect. Make it, strike that balance between convenience and security. And with that, back to the policies, these things need to be addressed within the privacy policy that you have. So if your employees need to comply with regulations and you don't have written policies that mention that, you're missing out on a big portion of the overall security and of the overall compliance portion. So that essentially brings us to the end of this particular presentation. We did save some time at the end, but I wanted to briefly talk about some of the upcoming events. We may or may not be transitioning our future events into all webinar, potentially some on-premise back once the travel restrictions get pulled off and the stay-at-home order gets pulled off, hopefully. But we'll continue to offer webinars and recorded events. This was a recorded event. We'll look at getting attendees with a link that they could download or replay the recording event. And with that said, I think we can get to the questions and answers. For closing remarks, Mark, if you had anything to close things out before we get into that, we can start there too.
Jared, this is John. One thing I wanted to kind of say about, when you were talking about security and, the great analogy you used of leaving your house open and stuff, is one of the things I always say with regard to security is you don't necessarily need to outrun the lion. You just have to outrun the slowest guy in your group. And so, because the way that unless you're being targeted, the way a lot of these hackers do is they throw a very wide net and they see what sticks. So as long as you're protecting yourself against that kind of stuff, the casualness and the email blasts and stuff like that, that's going to be a good, from my perspective, that's a good 80% of the result from 20% of the effort type of situation. The concern there is you have to make sure that you're being diligent, because the target for that balance is constantly changing. And so you need to make sure your diligence is up. You can't, security is not a project. It's an ongoing process. And so you want to make sure that you're constantly reevaluating that and, looking to the advice of your advisors from an IT perspective and saying, where do we need to be now, and kind of going from there.
I think that's a really good point, John. You can take it to the extreme, or you can start with building a foundation and seeing where you really need to be strengthening certain positions, or maybe this is something 5-year goal rather than a next 6 months goal. So I think that's a really good clarification point. Does anybody have any biggest challenges that they're having with working remotely, or with their employees working remotely? Any comments, suggestions, resources, situations people have come across? I tend to wonder if employees ask for certain things that the company can't provide from a tools standpoint, or if they wanted to, for example, bring their phone home, what does that look like? How does that get accomplished? We've had a variety of scenarios that customers have come to us and asked us for, how do I do this? How do I get my phones working remotely? How do I connect back into the office with a VPN? So I think if anybody had anything to add there, we can certainly address those questions today. Okay. Well, I think we are at a point where we can close this webinar. If anybody does have any questions, feel free to reach out to either Mark, John, or myself. We'll also be sending out the link to the recording, and we thank everybody for their time, and we hope you have a safe and productive work week.
Thank you, everybody, for attending.
Thank you, everyone.